From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors around the world. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and art historian living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. So, this is the second part of a two-part episode on the life of the sculptor Gutzon Borglum and his most famous sculpture, the Mount Rushmore Monument in South Dakota. Now, the first half of this two-part episode covered Borglum's life right up to the beginning of Mount Rushmore, so this part will focus almost entirely on the Mount Rushmore Monument itself. Now, if you haven't heard the first half, I'm pretty sure this episode will make sense to you just fine, though I do highly recommend listening to the first half just to get a sense of what sort of man Gutzon Borglum was, as an understanding of his problematic character, I think, is key to understanding how and why this monument was ever made. So, when we left off the story of Borglum's life, Gutzon Borglum was in fairly dire straits. He was on the run from the police for vandalizing his own work that he made for the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial Commission in Georgia. He was flat broke, and he had several unfinished commissions hanging over his head. And he also had a national reputation. And as I put it in the last episode, that reputation was as an erratic, bombastic, limelight-seeking, promise-breaking, impossible-to-work-with sculptor. Now, it would seem that at this point, and by the way, Gutzon Borglum was 58 years old at this point, you would think that he would be pretty finished as a sculptor. Borglum had burned just about every bridge he had crossed in his professional life. However, in February of 1925, when Borglum had tossed away the Stone Mountain Commission, which he should have regarded as the commission of a lifetime, Borglum had already been making plans to begin an even more ambitious project. Now, to tell the story of that project, we need to back up a few years and introduce a man by the name of Doane Robinson. Doane Robinson was the first historian of the state of South Dakota. Robinson was a native South Dakotan with a genuine love and passion for his state, which was filled with rugged beauty and colorful history. Many famous tales of the American West originated in South Dakota. Lewis and Clark traveled through there with Sacagawea. General Custer fought his last stand there at Little Bighorn. It was the home of the Lakota Sioux Native Americans, with famous leaders like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and Red Cloud. The town of Deadwood, South Dakota, is practically synonymous with the Wild West, and the people who lived and died there, people like Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and Wyatt Earp, just to name a few, those people are the stuff of legends. Just as wild as the populace of South Dakota were the geological formations, known as the Black Hills. The newly declared state park, Custer State Park, contains the best the Black Hills has to offer: forests, rivers, and especially the strange and rugged granite formations, ranging from ancient mountains, cliffs, bluffs, and enormous needles of granite rising like spires of cathedrals. There was much that Doane Robinson, as a state historian, could be proud of. But Robinson had a problem. Few people ever came to South Dakota to see and appreciate the state Robinson was so proud of. South Dakota was isolated by distance from most of the rest of the United States. There was no large city or center of commerce in South Dakota, and it really wasn't located on the way to anywhere else. You don't accidentally pass through South Dakota on your way from the East Coast to the West. It lies just too far north for that. In the early 1920s, travel by car was still in its early stages, and highways were just beginning to be a thing. Now, trying to capitalize on this newfangled mode of transportation, Robinson advertised and tried to popularize the notion of a travel route which would take travelers by car from Chicago to Yellowstone National Park, which is located west of South Dakota, but it would first pass through South Dakota. He figured that people willing to drive all the way there to see Yellowstone's natural wonders would also be interested in South Dakota's natural beauty. Doane Robinson's route, which he called the Black and Yellow Trail, wasn't the fastest route from Chicago to Yellowstone, and to get people to choose the Dakota route, Robinson needed, essentially, a roadside attraction. For all of South Dakota's natural beauty, it had nothing famous or iconic, like the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls or the Old Faithful geyser located in Yellowstone. Nothing to call a destination, nothing to make people pull over and stop for lunch. And so, Doane Robinson thought, such an attraction would just have to be built. Robinson, from the beginning, envisioned his roadside attraction to be a colossal statue. Large-scale statuary was a bit in vogue in the United States, from the Statue of Liberty to the Colossi at the Chicago World's Fair, to the recently completed Lincoln Memorial in Washington, to the stone mountain relief currently underway in Georgia. Large statues were a big hit wherever they were put up. If you built it, they would come. And South Dakota had some natural stone formations that Robinson thought would be perfectly suited for statuary, namely those needles I just mentioned, these granite pillars, some of them hundreds of feet tall, which rise out of the floor of the canyons of the Black Hills. Robinson thought they might be suitable to be carved into figures of famous South Dakotans. He first reached out to the Chicago sculptor Lorado Taft. In addition to colossal work made for the Chicago World's Fair, Taft had erected, on his own property in the state of Illinois, a 50-foot-tall concrete statue of a Native American, which he called the Big Injun, although now it's referred to as Black Hawk. However, due to ill health, Lorado Taft refused the offer of this commission. And so it came to pass that 6 months before Gutzon Borglum smashed his plaster casts and was fired from Stone Mountain, he received a letter from Doane Robinson. By that time, things had already turned sour between the Stone Mountain Monument Committee and Borglum, though the general public, including Doane Robinson, didn't yet have a clue of that. Borglum immediately responded to Robinson's initial letter, and within a month, Gutzon Borglum and his 12-year-old son, Lincoln, arrived in South Dakota to meet Robinson and to see these peculiar granite needles. Now, in his typical fashion, Borglum quickly dismissed Robinson's original idea of carving Lewis and Clark and Buffalo Bill into a bunch of granite needles in favor of something more grandiose and ambitious. Borglum saw this as an opportunity to make a national monument, not just a regional one. In Borglum's words, a monument that was national in the largest sense. After his return to Georgia, Borglum hashed out plans to carve the figures of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and sent these plans to Robinson, who readily accepted the proposal. Budgets were discussed, and a South Dakota senator, friendly to Doane Robinson, began to draft legislation approving of initial funding by the state of South Dakota for surveying and for the formation of a commission to oversee the project. Now, as much as Gutzon Borglum tried to keep this new commission a secret from the Stone Mountain Commission in Georgia, word quickly got out in the press that the famous Gutzon Borglum was considering taking on a huge commission in South Dakota. Now, this news was just one more sticking point between Borglum and the Stone Mountain Committee, who had already complained to Borglum about his frequent absences from the Stone Mountain project. When everything came to a head just a few months later, and Borglum was fired from Stone Mountain, Doane Robinson and his supporters in South Dakota were dismayed by all the negative press, but they were not dissuaded. After all, Robinson reasoned, this just means that Borglum could now focus entirely on his new commission. But work couldn't start immediately. There was simply no funding yet. The state Senate of South Dakota approved the idea of the monument, but with no money appropriated to the project. And so for the time being, Borglum spent the summer of 1925 in search of other work, and in evasion of debt collectors. In August of 1925, Borglum paid a second visit to South Dakota, where he was able to more closely survey possible sites for his monument. Now, on this trip, two major elements took shape to his proposal. One was the addition of two more figures to the initial two of Washington and Lincoln. The new figures would be Presidents Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt. The idea, Borglum explained, was to create a monument at the geographical center of the nation, which South Dakota more or less is, in honor of those who contributed most to the building of that nation. This would be a monument to the empire builders, to use Borglum's phrase. Washington was the father of the nation, and Lincoln preserved the union of the states. Jefferson was chosen due to his Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the territory of the United States and expanded the nation westward. And Theodore Roosevelt? Well, according to Borglum, Roosevelt should be so honored for having taken commercial control of Panama. If that sounds a bit of a stretch to you, well, you're not alone. Borglum was, of course, an ardent admirer of Roosevelt, and he wanted to honor his friend, who had died 5 years previously. But the choice of Roosevelt at the time was popular with South Dakotans as well. Roosevelt had spent time there in his youth, and he loved the West. And he had also created the national park system. He was a beloved figure by many, and his recent death had also fomented a general desire to have him memorialized. The other element of the monument decided upon at this time was its location. Ever since the plans to carve these granite needles into presidents went public, the idea had met with an amount of backlash, as the granite needles were unique, and many locals argued that they should just be left alone. Searching for an alternate siting, Borglum settled on a peak of granite near the mining town of Keystone. This mountain peak had been named only recently, at least by white men, and almost as a joke. So named after a New York lawyer on a trip to the area to inspect tin mines. The lawyer's name was Charles Rushmore. Rushmore asked his local guide what the name of this particular mountain was, and the guide reportedly responded that it had never had a name before, but from now on, we'll call it Rushmore. So the only thing still missing now was money to start. For the next year and a half, the Monument Commission and Gutzon Borglum would do everything they could think of to entice private donors to the project, but to no avail. The entire project may well have dried up and died at this point, were it not for the most serendipitous occurrence in the summer of 1927. That summer, the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, decided to come and spend his summer vacation in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Borglum saw this as an opportunity to bend the ear of the president and possibly secure national funding. He decided to stage a grand inauguration marking the beginning of work on Mount Rushmore, even though he had already staged a grand opening 2 years previously, though no work had been done on the mountain since. Borglum was hoping to gain some national press by inviting the president to attend and possibly even make a speech there. It was a bit of a long-shot strategy, though. President Coolidge was on vacation, and even when he wasn't, he was not much inclined to public speaking, and was notoriously short with words, which earned him the nickname Silent Cal. All he wanted to do on his vacation in the Black Hills was fish, and he tried to avoid interacting with locals as much as possible. Gutzon Borglum decided to pull a bit of a stunt to attract the president's attention. He hired an airplane to barnstorm the hunting lodge in which the Coolidge family was staying, and he even had the pilot drop a large wreath into their yard, which carried the message, "Greetings from Mount Rushmore to Mount Coolidge." And somehow this actually worked, and Coolidge agreed to attend the inauguration and give a speech. And during the ceremony, Borglum pressed his luck even further, and just off the top of his head declared that Coolidge should be the author of the inscription that would go at the base of the sculpture. In return, and seemingly off the top of his head, the president stated publicly that he would support Borglum in his quest for federal funding. Suddenly, with those words, Mount Rushmore was no longer merely a potential South Dakota project, it was now a potential national monument. Now, the support of the president would have meant a lot more to Borglum and to Mount Rushmore if it weren't for the fact that 10 days before he spoke at Rushmore, President Coolidge announced that he would not be seeking re-election. Now, having the verbal support of a president on his way out was still better than nothing, but certainly not a guarantee. It was good press, though, and some private donations did start to trickle in, enough to finally hire a small starting crew and begin material preparations in earnest. Work finally began on the mountain in October of 1927, but was halted only 6 weeks later in December by the oncoming winter. And just that 6 weeks of work which was mostly building scaffolding and clearing away weathered portions of the mountain face, well, just that 6 weeks put the project into debt. Carving the side of a mountain was clearly both expensive and a fair-weather job. That winter, Borglum was in Washington, D.C., where he was able to get a funding bill drafted by the help of a few friendly senators, but the bill languished in Congress for an entire year, meaning no work was done on the mountain in 1928. Finally, during Calvin Coolidge's last week in office, he signed the bill which granted Borglum up to $250,000 in matching funds. It wasn't close to what the monument was projected to cost, but it was enough to get started. In June of 1929, more than 4 years after being approached initially by state historian Doane Robinson, Gutzon Borglum finally began work on Mount Rushmore. And what exactly was work like on Mount Rushmore? How do you go about carving heads 60 feet high into a granite cliff face? We're going to learn all about it when the sculptor's funeral continues. Well, hey there. I hope everyone is doing well. Once again, thanks for your patience in waiting for this long overdue Part 2 episode. I just wanted to take a second and thank very much all the people who made my trip to Australia and New Zealand this past spring so fantastically amazing. Seriously, it was not just a good trip or a fun trip. It opened my eyes to new things and sort of permanently changed my perspective on what I'm doing with my life and how I'm doing it. To say the trip was energizing or invigorating is putting it mildly. So thank you to Jome and Peter and Greg in Perth, and to Pilar and Andrew in Melbourne, to Jody in Sydney, and to Tatiana and Stefan in Wellington. Also, thanks to Ree at Weta Workshop in Wellington for giving me the chance to lecture at Weta Workshop and for giving me a fantastic behind-the-scenes tour. And a shout-out to all the new friends I met along the way. I hope to see you all next year, as plans are in the works for another tour in the spring of 2019, with additional workshops, hopefully, in Brisbane and also in Hobart, Tasmania. So the rest of the summer is shaping up nicely for me. I hope it is for you too. In a few weeks, in mid-June, I'm going to be heading to San Jose, California, near the San Francisco Bay, to teach a few workshops at the School of Visual Philosophy. I'm going to be teaching portraiture in clay using the sight-size method, as well as my weekend sculpture composition and wax sketching course, which is a nice little mix of learning how to make sketch models in wax, with a good dose of history of sculpture composition, topped off with the sort of general ontology of statuary itself, how to go beyond making figure studies to making statues. There really isn't another course like this anywhere that I know of, and I'm pretty happy to offer something like it. Again, that's at the School of Visual Philosophy in San Jose, and I think there are still a few places left on both courses. So if you're interested, check it out online. Then in mid-July, I'm off to Ann Arbor, Michigan, close to where I grew up and where my family still lives, to teach portraiture and clay once again in collaboration with Artensity. Very excited about this one because one of my sisters is actually going to be my portrait model. There's still maybe, I think, 2 spaces left on this course as we speak, or as I speak. So sign up fast if you're interested in the course. And then I'm going to be heading a little bit later in the summer, in late July, over to the UK, to Dorset, actually, where I'm going to be teaching figure modeling in clay from life at Art and Sculpture in the Barn. And I'm also going to be offering my composition sketch course there as well. And finally, from there on to Salisbury, to Sarum Studios, to teach both figure modeling and portrait modeling. And then, at last, back to my beloved Florence, where you can find me giving private lessons anytime that I'm not doing traveling workshops. And if you ever find yourself passing through Florence, even for a day, stop into the studio and say hello. I'm always happy to meet you guys. So have a great and sunny and warm summer, unless you're in Australia and New Zealand, in which case stay warm and cozy, snuggled up next to your kangaroos or whatever you guys do to stay warm. So let's get right to it. How do you carve a 60-foot head into a granite mountain face? Well, you do it in a way similar to how you go about carving a more modest life-size head in marble or stone. That is, you make a clay model first. And when you have perfected your design and the clay model looks just like what you want the eventual stone head to look like, you cast it in plaster, and then copy that plaster cast into your block of marble. And how do you do that? Well, it's not done merely by eyeballing your plaster cast and then just going for it with a hammer and chisel. No, for almost as long as sculptors have been making decently realistic work, there have been tools and processes for accurately transferring the location of precise points off of a three-dimensional surface, like a plaster cast, and locating those points in the volume of a block of stone. And this process is called pointing. If you are familiar with the technique of pointing, you probably know about the pointing machine, or macchinetta a punto. This is a device invented and perfected in the 18th century, and it's generally the easiest method of transferring points. I won't get into an explanation of the pointing machine, but if you are interested, I did make a video a few years ago which gives step-by-step instructions on how to use the pointing machine, and I posted it on the YouTube channel for the Sculptor's Funeral, so check it out there if you want to know more. But before the invention of the macchinetta, before the invention of the pointing machine, the method in near universal use was the use of compasses. Now, when I say compasses, I am referring to those ice-tong-looking things that are almost universally and erroneously referred to by sculptors as calipers. Calipers are a different tool. Now, most sculptors have wooden compasses in their collection of tools, though stone compasses are made of steel and can be quite large and heavy. Now, the compass technique uses the same geometrical principles as the pointing machine, but the compass method is slower, it's a little bit more complex, and it's a little bit easier to do incorrectly. But compasses can be used to enlarge or reduce a sculpture being carved, which is a great advantage over the pointing machine. The pointing machine can only transfer points to produce a work of equal scale, right? So using compasses, you can create larger-than-life-size heads in stone from a life-size plaster cast. But in the case of Gutzon Borglum's colossal heads of the presidents, they were intended to be 60 feet tall. Theoretically, you could construct compasses large enough to get the job done, but how can you use a compass 50 or 60 feet long while hanging off the side of a cliff? For this, and for a lot of other reasons, the compass technique just was not tenable. Fortunately, another sculptor had devised a contraption for taking points that could be adapted for use on Mount Rushmore, and that sculptor was the early Renaissance artist Leon Battista Alberti, and the device he invented was described in detail in a book Alberti wrote in 1436 called De Statua. Now, the fascinating thing about Borglum using Alberti's device is that it's pretty much the only instance I've ever found anywhere of a sculptor using the device. It's a pretty unwieldy device, and it doesn't do the job any better than compasses can, but it's perfectly suited for monumental work. Gutzon Borglum used it successfully on his Stone Mountain relief in Georgia, as far as that got, and so he once again constructed the device at Mount Rushmore. Now, I should point out that Gutzon Borglum never, at least as far as I can find, he never seems to have acknowledged his debt owed to Leon Battista Alberti, which of course would be right in line with Borglum's character, not to give credit when due to others. But it is also possible that Borglum reinvented the device himself. It's a simple enough device, and I think it's kind of a fairly inevitable solution to the task at hand. Alberti's device, which he called, again, a definitore, is simply a disc with a long boom arm coming off the center of the disc, like an exceedingly long minute hand on a clock face. Now, imagine this disc fixed horizontally to the top of the head of a plaster cast, so that this long minute hand, this boom arm, extends out over, say, the front of the face on your cast. Now, finally, what you do is you hang a plumb line off of this boom arm, right? And that's it. That's the definitore. To locate a point on the cast, let's say you want to find the tip of the nose, what you do is you simply swivel the boom to sort of be placed sort of over the nose, and then you hang the plumb line along the length of the boom arm, and you hang that plumb line in just such a way, and you adjust the length of the plumb line, the line itself, in just such a way so that the point of the plumb bob is touching the tip of the nose, right? And now the location of this point can be then recorded through 3 measurements, just like plotting a 3-dimensional point using X, Y, and Z measurements, right? So X will be the degree of rotation of the boom arm around the disc. Y will be the distance from the center of the disc to the plumb line, where it hangs off the boom. And Z is the distance down to where the plumb bob hangs, right? The length of the line. X, Y, Z. It's a bit complex, yes. But if you can't visualize it, you can go to the Sculptor's Funeral website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, where I have pictures in the image gallery for this episode, which is episode number 74. I made a little model definitory for myself a few years back when I wrote a translation of Alberti's book, and I have pictures of my definitory there. But I've also visited Mount Rushmore. I went there 3 years ago, and in the museum that they have on site, they have remnants of the definitories that Borglum actually constructed and used on the monument. I also recommend doing a Google search for historical pictures of Mount Rushmore being built. I can't post a lot of the pictures online simply due to copyright issues, which Mount Rushmore very, very closely guards. But for some reason, they're still available online anyway. So do an image search, and you'll see a lot of really interesting pictures of the definitory in use on Mount Rushmore. So anyway, so now that you have the point located on the plaster cast, the tip of the nose is now located using the definitory. How do you transfer that point to the mountain? Well, what you do is you build a second definitory, one on top of the mountain, but larger in scale. Right? So Gutzon Borglum's working plaster casts had heads that were 6 feet tall, and he wanted to scale those dimensions up by a factor of 10 so that the final heads, as I've mentioned, were 60 feet tall. So what he did, he built his definitories on the mountain 10 times larger as the ones he built on his plaster casts. So instead of a boom arm mounted to a disc up on the mountain, what he basically had with his large definitories were essentially construction cranes mounted on a swivel base. Now that Borglum had machines that could accurately transfer his measurements, he now needed to drill into the mountain face to locate those points. And the system he perfected on the face of Stone Mountain for the Confederate War Memorial was the one he used at Mount Rushmore as well. And it's a fascinating system. To me, it's one of the more interesting aspects of Mount Rushmore. This system involved several teams of 3 people, right? So on the team, you have the carver, the winchman, and the callboy. And here's how they worked. The winchman controlled a windlass or a winch mounted at the top of the mountain, right? And he would carefully lower the carver on a cable over the side of the mountain. The carver himself was strapped into a bosun's chair, which is sort of a harness used on tall ships at sea. So the carver would slowly walk backwards off the top of the mountain as the winchman unwound the cable the carver was attached to. Also attached onto this cable was the carver's jackhammer. Now, due to the fact the carver was dangling over a cliff on the mountain face, and the winchman was on top of the mountain, they couldn't really see or hear each other very well, which is where the callboy came in. The callboy was basically hanging over the top of the cliff face, sort of in sight of both the carver and the winchman, and he could relay messages between the winchman and the carver. And in this way, the winchman could put the carver exactly where he needed to be. Then the carver's job was to remove material from the surface of the mountain. Using a jackhammer while hanging off the side of a mountain suspended on a steel cable is about as difficult as it sounds. A carver would have to place his feet on the face of the mountain and sort of push off and sort of stand away from the mountain almost horizontally, hanging in this bosun's chair, and then he would place the bit of the jackhammer between his feet. At times, he would actually have to pass a chain around his waist and attach the ends of the chain to the mountain itself, and this was to avoid having the force of the jackhammer bounce him away from the surface of the mountain. All right? Complex. Now, the drilling was done in 3 stages. Now, the first stage was just rough removal, just clearing away volume in order to get close to the intended surface of the sculpture. The carvers would drill a series of holes, and then an amount of dynamite would be packed into that hole, and then the charge would be set. Blasting happened twice a day, at lunch and after work, so that no one would actually be on the mountain when it occurred. Once the initial blasting was over and the surface of the mountain was only about a foot or so away from the intended finish surface of the sculpture, carvers would then drill a series of closely packed holes, and this was called honeycombing. The honeycombing could then be fairly easily chiseled away with the jackhammers to arrive within an inch of the final surface of the sculpture. And then the final surface could be textured with a bushing hammer mounted to the jackhammer. Now, the head of a bushing hammer looks kind of like a meat tenderizer. It's like a clump of little stout points, which you sort of play over the surface of the stone, and it gives a nice, evenly textured surface. It doesn't give a smooth surface, but from the great distance at which the monument is seen, a smooth or polished surface just isn't needed. And who were the workers who actually performed all this dangerous, heavy labor? While Gutzon Borglum himself never hesitated to throw himself over the side of the mountain in a sling and jackhammer away at the granite surface, even when he was well into his 60s, he, of course, was best put to use as the director of the many men who performed the carving, the measuring, the blasting, the winching, the communication, and support. South Dakota was and still is a center of mining in the United States, and as you might expect, it's a lot more convenient to train local miners to carve granite than to train sculptors to use a jackhammer. So skilled labor was never in short supply. Now, as dangerous as all this work sounds, there were only a few accidents on Mount Rushmore, and there were no fatalities. Borglum did show a genuine concern for his workers, and he was a stickler for safety. Any man who showed up to work drunk, or even slightly hungover, or even feeling a little bit under the weather, was sent home. And just to be sure, Borglum would often have tomato juice sent up the mountain on Monday mornings as a hangover remedy. Now, at the same time, Borglum was Borglum, and the workers soon grew accustomed to his notorious irrationality and temper. Workers could be, and were, fired for just about anything that crossed Borglum's imagination, although, quite often, those same workers were hired back on the next day. One worker later in life was quite proud of the fact that he held the record for being fired and rehired on the mountain a total of 8 times. So despite Borglum's temper and the grueling work, the workers seemed to genuinely enjoy working on the mountain and largely felt that they were doing something significant. There was a very strong camaraderie amongst the workers, who even organized a baseball team, and they would play against similar teams organized from the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was an organization of labor which was building infrastructure in the nearby Custer State Park in the 1930s. Borglum cherished the fact that Rushmore had its own baseball team, and the rumor among his workers was that you had a much better chance of being hired and of keeping your job on the mountain if you could pitch or hit. Morale was usually not quite so high for Borglum's chief assistants, of whom he had several, and who were fired or quit one by one, as they were the ones who would bear the brunt of Borglum's rage, or, due to the ongoing financial problems of the project, could go unpaid for months. When Borglum's 4th or 5th such supervisor resigned in 1934, Borglum appointed his 22-year-old son, Lincoln, as chief assistant, who proved to be capable and well-liked by the men. As construction stretched into the late 30s, Lincoln Borglum became instrumental to the monument, as his father became more and more absent from the project and as his health started to decline. Throughout the entire 1930s, Mount Rushmore sees an endlessly repeating cycle of the project going broke, which led to work stoppages, which resulted in Borglum appealing to friends in high places and pulling stunts to attract attention to the monument. And sooner or later, this was followed by a funding boost coming from a reluctant Congress, followed by a surge in work on the monument until the money once again ran dry. There was one hugely important event that happened early on in the project that both changed the nature of the funding for the monument, but also changed the way the federal government and the citizens of the country thought about Mount Rushmore. And that, of course, was the stock market crash in 1929 and the resulting Great Depression. Now, do you remember how I said Congress approved to give matching grant money to the project in June of 1929? Well, matching grant money means the government would only give an amount equal to what the Monument Commission could raise privately. Well, the stock market crash occurred only 4 months after that agreement. But the financial calamity of the Great Depression actually turned out to be good news for Mount Rushmore. In the first place, both Borglum and the government could plainly see that the chances now for the Mount Rushmore project to raise private funds were practically nil. If the project were to continue at all, it would have to be funded by the government, which it did, both reluctantly and sporadically, and usually not without a fight. Second, because the project was now in the eye and the mind of the public, thanks to Borglum's endless publicity stunts and unveilings and celebrations, which took place as each portrait materialized on the mountain, Mount Rushmore started to take shape in the minds of the American public as more than an audacious roadside attraction. Mount Rushmore, in the days of the Great Depression, came to be seen widely as a symbol of the strength and resilience of the American spirit. The quest to conquer this mountain in a way never attempted before, and in spite of the odds, was an allegory for America's struggle to conquer the financial and societal obstacles now set before it. Ceasing work on Mount Rushmore, likewise, would be symbolic of America giving up on itself. Before the Great Depression, the project had many critics and detractors, from environmentalists and conservationists to fiscal conservatives who saw the federal funding of the monument as a waste of time and money. After the Great Depression, even the fiscal conservatives could see the monument's intrinsic value to the morale of the nation. It was this newfound sentiment that led to the organization of the Mount Rushmore Memorial Society, which was a governmental organization which assisted with the handling of government funding, as well as taking up the task of eventually expanding the scope of the monument to include landscaping the surrounding grounds, developing infrastructure like roads and parking, which could accommodate the tourists who were already coming in by the hundreds every day to view the monument's progress. Also, because of the expanded nature of government funding, the absolute power that Borglum had up to that point wielded was mitigated somewhat by the Memorial Society, who now held the purse strings. But now that the project had taken on the character of a national monument and had caught the imagination and sentiments of the American public, Gutzon Borglum himself did not hesitate to capitalize on this new sentiment. He saw, too, that the time was right to expand the scope of the monument. Borglum had always intended that his 4 presidents be accompanied by an inscription and by a visitors' center/museum, much like his designs for the ill-fated Confederate Memorial on Stone Mountain in Georgia. But, as so often was the case, Borglum proved to be his own worst enemy. There were several elements that Borglum envisioned for the monument that never saw the light of day due to Borglum's temperament. For instance, after he got President Coolidge to agree to provide the inscription for the monument, Borglum saw fit to then edit and even add to Coolidge's inscription, in a way that drew criticism from the press for being presumptuous and arrogant, as well as incurring the ire of Coolidge himself, who then withdrew from the project. Here's the thing. The bill that was passed in order to fund the inscription carried the provision that this bill would fund an inscription by Coolidge and only Coolidge. So when Coolidge withdrew support, the inscription lost funding and ultimately was never included on the monument. Now, funding for the inscription was absolutely necessary, because we're not talking about something like a commemorative plaque. The inscription would have come in the form of an entablature so large that it could be easily read from the viewing platform of Mount Rushmore a quarter-mile away, consisting of a text of hundreds of words carved in lettering 3 feet high. Gutzon Borglum's Hall of Records was another aspect of the monument that was never completed, though it was near and dear to Borglum's heart, and something that he considered as important to the monument as the portraits of the presidents. Like many of Borglum's ideas, it started reasonably sized, but then grew to outlandish proportions. Initially, the idea was to construct a museum and an archive related to the monument and to the history of the United States, basically a visitor's center carved into the base of the backside of the mountain. This eventually was inflated to the idea of a Hall of Records, which would house copies of the founding documents of the United States, like, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, as well as housing a history of the expansion of the American Empire across the continent and across the world. All this would be housed in an excavated room about 100 feet square. But even this was eventually not enough for Borglum. In its final form, in Borglum's mind, the Hall of Records became something more like the Library of Congress combined with the Parthenon, combined with Superman's Fortress of Solitude. So check this out. His final plan for the Hall of Records consisted of at least a half dozen rooms, all about 100 feet to a side. And these rooms would contain dozens of busts and statues of the great men of America, from Benjamin Franklin to the Wright brothers. Other rooms would contain special cabinets, which housed the vital records of the history of the United States, everything from the founding documents to census records, all of which would be stamped into aluminum sheets and then housed in waterproof containers and then put into these special cabinets. These special cabinets, Borglum stipulated, could only be opened by an act of Congress. The rooms themselves would be finished with mosaics and murals and a gigantic frieze depicting, quote, the adventure of humanity discovering and occupying the West world. And it didn't stop there. The approach and entrance to the Hall of Records was just as grandiose. The hall would be located in a canyon which sort of runs around the backside of the presidential portraits, near the summit of the mountain. Right? So to access this lofty canyon, Borglum conceived of an enormous staircase, 800 feet long, rivaling that of the approach of the Parthenon in Athens. Upon ascending this staircase, the visitor to the Hall of Records would find himself face to face with the grand entrance, consisting of enormous doors cast in glass, above which would be carved an eagle with a wingspan of nearly 40 feet. Columns topped with torches 40 feet high carved in granite would then flank these doors, and finally an inscription declaring this the Hall of Records, the archive of America's onward march. Now, as we know, this amazing Hall of Records never materialized, and that was for a few reasons. One was that Borglum actually turned down assistance on building his grand staircase, and this assistance would have come from the Civilian Conservation Corps. And he turned it down because he thought they wouldn't do a good enough job in building a staircase that he wanted to rival the Parthenon. The Memorial Society, basically Borglum's boss, was not too impressed with this decision, as the staircase would then have been funded by other sources rather than through the funds allocated to Mount Rushmore directly. Subsequently, the commissioners of the Mount Rushmore Memorial Society directed Borglum to concentrate on the presidents, and to remove the crews he had put in place to start the Hall of Records and put them back on the portraits. Once he did that, the Hall of Records never made it any farther. All we have of the Hall of Records is an excavated cavern behind the back of the heads of the presidents, about 75 feet deep. I can't help but think that had Borglum said yes to help on the staircase, not only would the staircase have been built, it would have also spurred interest in and progress on the Hall of Records itself. But once again, we have Gutzon Borglum allowing perfection to be the enemy of good. So as mentioned, Borglum's son, Lincoln, became more and more an instrumental part of the Mount Rushmore project beginning in 1934, which lessened the burden on his aging father somewhat, although Gutzon Borglum was a near constant presence on the mountain when he wasn't in Washington wooing support from Congress and the national press, or when he wasn't traveling around the country in search of yet more work which he could not possibly take on. In the late 1930s, Borglum's prostate was acting up, and in early 1940 he underwent surgery to treat it, and this slowed Borglum down a fair bit. But by 1940, all 4 heads of the presidents were all but finished, almost to the point at which we find the monument today. However, the 4 presidents as we know them today are a far cry from what Borglum initially intended. Almost from the beginning, as we've seen, the composition included these 4 presidents, but each of these 4 were meant to be rendered as half-length portraits, that is, figures fully rendered almost to the waist. The heads were meant to be just the beginning. Over the years, the arrangement of the figures changed according to the suitability of the mountain itself. The first thing that happened when a new president was started was the stripping of the weathered surface of the mountain face to reveal fresh, solid granite. Now this was fundamental. You couldn't start a head until you dug deep into the mountain to find good, unweathered stone. The quality of the stone differed greatly from one site on the mountain to the other, and therefore, how much stone was stripped away before carving began differed greatly from president to president. For example, 25 feet of granite had to be removed before locating Washington's face, and for Jefferson, it was 60 feet. And believe it or not, actually, the portrait of Thomas Jefferson was first carved to George Washington's right, instead of on his left, where we find it today. When the first Jefferson head was nearing completion, a fissure was found to cut right through the nostril, and this fissure went deep enough into the stone that would result in a weakness that would have led to the eventual crumbling of most of the head. So a new Jefferson was carved on the other side of Washington, and the first head was dynamited off. Notice, too, that Jefferson's head, as we see it today, seems to be tilted upward. Now, this was not a merely aesthetic choice. It was actually done in order to avoid another fissure in the stone. And then there's the portrait of Theodore Roosevelt, set very, very deeply into the mountain. For Roosevelt, the dynamite crews had to blast about 120 feet deep into the side of the mountain before they could find suitable granite in which to carve the portrait. So the idea was, once the heads were all finally located in good granite and then fleshed out, work could then begin on the rest of their bodies. This is most evident in the section of the mountain below George Washington, where we can clearly see his collar. And Thomas Jefferson seems to be looking over what will be Washington's shoulder. The portrait of Abraham Lincoln is the least finished portrait on the mountain, with a mass of sort of uncarved rock where his hair should be. But even so, we can see Lincoln is sporting a bit of an upturned collar, and there's even the faint ghost of his fingers of his left hand as they seem to reach inside his jacket. Even a force of nature the likes of Gutzon Borglum had to come to an end. And in the spring of 1941, only months before America would enter the Second World War already raging in Europe, Borglum died of an embolism related to an additional recent surgery. It was quickly decided that the work on the mountain remain largely as it was, with Gutzon's son Lincoln in charge of the final touches and cleanup, preserving Borglum's masterpiece as a permanent work in progress. And what an amazing legacy for a sculptor to leave the world. What took Borglum and his crew a little over a decade to carve into granite will be recognizable as portraits for tens of thousands of years. The site was finally vacated in October of 1941, just weeks before the attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, when once again Mount Rushmore took on renewed meaning and relevance in the minds of the American public. What started out as a roadside tourist attraction in the hands of a megalomaniac artist grew into the most improbable and, for better or worse, most quintessentially American work of art. But don't think for a second that the story of Mount Rushmore ends here. I've been talking about Rushmore for nearly an hour, but I have not yet mentioned the controversies and ironies and problematic contexts that have surrounded Mount Rushmore from the very start. I wanted to tell the story of Mount Rushmore's creation in a fairly straightforward way first, for the sake of clarity. I've told the story of how it came to be and what it was meant to represent in the minds of its creators and supporters, but I haven't told the story of what the monument represents to many Americans. I just previously remarked that the monument, for better or worse, is quintessentially American. Well, here's what I mean by worse. Before Mount Rushmore was jokingly named after a New York lawyer, it had another name. The Seven Grandfathers is the name the Lakota Sioux Native American people gave it long before anyone of European descent ever laid eyes on it. The Seven Grandfathers is situated in a large parcel of land in the Black Hills, which legally was the homeland of the Lakota Sioux, according to the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868, a treaty between the U.S. government and the Sioux people, and a treaty that was broken by the U.S. government only 8 years later. So not only is Mount Rushmore a sculpture erected on land that was stolen from its legal sovereigns, the Lakota Sioux, it's a sculpture paying tribute to the heroes of the American Empire, all of whom played significant roles in diminishing Native culture and robbing Native Americans of their land and their lives. Even Abraham Lincoln. Few people know that the largest public execution in the United States happened at the hand of Abraham Lincoln, when he signed 39 death warrants of Sioux Indians, who in 1862 revolted against the U.S. government after a long period of abuse, neglect, and confinement to a reservation. It's hard to imagine, or it's even hard to draw a parallel to what Mount Rushmore must mean to the descendants of the Sioux Indians. I don't know, I suppose if you imagine if Hitler had successfully conquered England in World War II, and then had his own face, along with Mussolini and Hirohito's, carved into the White Cliffs of Dover, I suppose that's maybe similar. I don't know. But it's bad. I mean, you can't look at it from the point of view of the Native Americans and have anything positive to say about Mount Rushmore. So it's little wonder to learn that almost since its completion, Mount Rushmore has been a focal point and a rallying cry for the American Indian movement, which seeks, rather hopelessly, for reparations and reconciliation with the American government and all the treaties that government has broken throughout its history. Today, Mount Rushmore has a mixed role as a nationalistic icon, an ironic embarrassment, and a cheesy tourist attraction. And personally, my feelings about Mount Rushmore and its callous origins and the repulsive nature of its creator leaves me with more negative feelings than positive ones. But at the same time, I think that one day, far, far into the future, Mount Rushmore will be regarded as one of the most significant works of art ever created, a succinct summation of all that the American Empire was and will be. We often say that great art is a true reflection of the culture in which it was created, and I think that someday, long after there's no such thing as a Lakota Sioux Indian, and long after there's no such thing as the United States, whoever is there to witness this monument, hundreds or thousands of years from now, might well see it as an encapsulation of all the grandiose ambitions of European settlers on the North American continent, who proclaimed their Enlightenment ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy. And at the same time, if our future selves can remember and learn from history, it shall stand as an encapsulation of how far America fell short of those ideals. I want to thank you all for listening. I can't end the podcast, though, before I acknowledge an author and a book from which I derived a great deal of this podcast. The author is John Taliaferro, and the book is called Great White Fathers, the story of the obsessive quest to create Mount Rushmore. And I'll tell you, these 2 episodes about Gutzon Borglum and Mount Rushmore, they're barely Cliff's Notes, no pun intended, for this fantastic, fantastic book. If you want to know more, I mean like a lot more, about every aspect of the Mount Rushmore Monument and its history and its meaning and relevance and construction, all you need to do is read this book. There have been a ton of books written about Mount Rushmore, but this one I found to be the most comprehensive and level-headed one that I came across. There are several, especially, the early books about Mount Rushmore that sort of whitewash over all the more problematic aspects of the monument and its creator. And I think if you want to fully appreciate the monument, you need both sides. I think I like Mount Rushmore a little bit more now than when I did before I read this book. Maybe like is not the right word. Maybe understand, appreciate. I'm not sure what the right word is. I suppose I appreciate how much Mount Rushmore makes me think about the meaning and power of art. And for that alone, I can appreciate the monument pretty deeply. Anyway, don't forget to check out additional content at the Sculptor's Funeral website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, or our YouTube channel, and also on our Facebook group page. And while you're there, you can join in the conversation with more than 1,000 other listeners. Feel free to ask me a question, or post an interesting link, or show off your work, or just bask in the fellowship of like-minded people. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or on the dozens of other podcast apps out there, whichever one you use. Subscribing means you receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device as soon as new episodes air. And if you want to help the podcast reach other people, leave a review or give the podcast some sort of rating wherever you happen to subscribe. I'm not kidding. It's not like an ego thing. Leaving a good review actually does help me reach new listeners. Also, as always, at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can stream the complete archives of the show. You can check out the image galleries for this and for other episodes, and you can support the podcast by buying some Sculptor's Funeral merchandise or by making a donation. And finally, if you need to stock your studio, click on the link to the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies, at thesculptorsfuneral.com. By clicking on the link and then buying from Blick, you help to support the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.